Hi, thanks for watching. In this lesson, we're going to talk about sentences and everything you need to know about the four major types to be a brilliant sentence writer. So we have three objectives for this lesson. First is to understand the fundamentals of sentences. How do sentences work? Second, we're going to understand the four major sentence types: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Finally, we're going to understand, through looking at the sentences, how to avoid major sentence errors like run-ons, comma splices, and fragments. So let's get into it. So the simple sentence is the building block of all sentences. A simple sentence is basically one subject and at least one verb. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Very basic simple sentence, I go. Right? We have the subject and we have a verb. Joe spent the other day fishing down by the river. Subject of the sentence, Joe, verb, spent the other day fishing down by the river. Since it has Joe spent, we have a complete sentence, although I didn't put the period here. You need to end your sentences with a period. Can you get me some milk? Subject of the sentence, you, verb, get. Even though it's a question, still a complete sentence. It has a subject and a verb. Here's another simple sentence. Sally came to me and asked me if I would go to her wedding. So here, the subject, again, is Sally. Sally's the subject. Came is the verb, came to me, and asked me if I would go to her wedding. So in this case, we have two verbs, one subject. So Sally came and asked. That could happen sometimes. But as long as there's one subject, you're still simple sentence, even though there's two verbs. Flying over the city at night is entrancing. Here's another simple sentence. What's the subject? Could it be flying? Well, flying is a verb, isn't it? Flying looks like a verb, but anytime you put an ing on a verb, you turn it into a noun. So flying over the city is the subject of this sentence. That's a thing. Flying over the city, flying over the city at night, that's a thing. Is the verb, entrancing. This is called the gerund. So we're going to come back to gerunds, and you're going to see them again in a little bit. But you want to be really careful with your ing verbs, because they're not verbs anymore. They're nouns, and it changes the entire structure of the sentence. The compound sentence is the second type of sentence. A compound sentence is basically two simple sentences connected by either a semicolon, it's kind of confusing the way I put it, the semicolon, or a comma and a conjunction, such as comma and. So there are 7 coordinating conjunctions, right? So and you remember them by the acronym FANBOYS. So the 7 coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So these are appropriate to use with a comma in order to connect two simple sentences into one compound sentence. Alternatively, you could use the semicolon. So you have one simple sentence, semicolon, another simple sentence. Basically, the semicolon takes the place of the period. You're connecting two sentences, but you're not saying how those two sentences are related or connected. When you use a coordinating conjunction with a comma, you're telling the reader, I'm moving on to a new sentence, and you're also telling the reader the relationship of the two sentences. And is a connecting word, so somebody says this, comma, and somebody says this, we're connecting. But is a sort of opposing idea. Those are probably the two most common. So is like as a result. Those are actually the 3 most common that you'll see, although these are the 7 that you can use. So the compound sentence, subject plus a verb, and then you need either a semicolon or a comma and a conjunction, a subject plus a verb. It's a little abstract, but let's take a quick look at some examples of compound sentences so we can see how they're basically two simple sentences. One simple sentence here, comma and a conjunction, one simple sentence here. All the compound sentence is just the connection of the two simple sentences. I wanted to go, but Bill wanted to stay. Here's a compound sentence. Subject of the first part is I wanted to go. We have a comma and a conjunction, comma, but Bill wanted to stay. So we have a subject and a verb, comma, conjunction, subject and a verb. So here's a good example of a pretty simple, straightforward compound sentence. Here's another one. Sometimes I feel happy, comma, and other times I feel sad. So the subject of the first part of the sentence is I. Sometimes I feel happy, and we have the comma and the conjunction again. Other times I feel sad. So we have two different subjects and two different verbs. If we did this, sometimes I feel happy, and other times sad. Here we would only have one subject. I feel happy and other times sad. Since we put the I back in here with feel back in here, now it's a compound sentence. Here's another one. Susan does not like kale, comma, yet she loves broccoli. So here we have Susan does not like kale, and then we have a comma and conjunction, yet, comma, yet she loves broccoli. Here's one with the semicolon. Go to the mountains, the air is so fresh. So what's the subject of this phrase? The verb is go. The subject is, like I mentioned before, you, since this is a directive, it's a command. You go to the mountains, semicolon. The air is fresh, so fresh. So here again we have a compound sentence, two complete ideas connected by the semicolon. Notice how the semicolon is very non-directional. It doesn't sort of tell us the relationship between the two, it just sort of says these two are similar or related, I'm putting them in the same sentence together. Basically takes the place of the period. That's a good way to think of the semicolon. And here's another one. There are many ways to make sentences, semicolon. The trick is understanding subjects and verbs. Really good thought here, and also a compound sentence. There are many ways to make sentences. The trick is understanding subjects and verbs. And here's the semicolon. This is a better use of the semicolon, I think. Oh, this one's pretty good too. These two ideas are very closely related. There are many ways to make sentences. The trick is understanding subjects and verbs. It's almost like a continuation of the thought. That's a good use for a semicolon. So that's the idea of the compound sentence. Two simple sentences connected by a semicolon or a comma and a coordinating conjunction, such as any of the fanboys conjunctions. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So hopefully you got that one. Let's take a look at the next type of sentence, the complex sentence. Sounds very complicated. It's actually not too complicated. The complex sentence contains one simple sentence and a subordinating clause created with a subordinating conjunction, such as because. There are many different types of subordinating conjunctions, and these are the words you use to make complex sentences. In the same way you use coordinating conjunctions to make compound sentences, such as any of the fanboys ones, you use subordinating conjunctions to make complex sentences. There are many subordinating conjunctions, but the most common ones are after, although, as, because, before, even though, which isn't a word, it's actually a phrase, if, since, unless, when, and while. When you use a word like this, you make something subordinate. So for instance, if we said, if the cat jumps off the chair, that's not a complete sentence, although the cat jumps off the chair is a complete sentence. When we put the word if in it, it makes it dependent on something else, so it makes it a subordinating phrase. So all of these conjunctions make phrases subordinate. So here's the graphic. a subject plus a verb plus a subordinating phrase. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of some complex sentences. Here's one. Because I was very tired, I decided to go home. What's the subject of this sentence? There's only one subject, right? It's I, right here. I decided to go home. This right here is a complete simple sentence. You could just say, I decided to go home, period, and that's a sentence. This right here, because I was very tired, is not a complete sentence, although I was very tired is a complete sentence. Right? Since we put the word because in here, it makes it subordinate on something else. Because I was very tired, and you have to finish the thought, I decided to go home. So that's the complex sentence. It has this, a subordinating phrase, and a complete thought or a complete simple sentence. Because I was very tired, comma, I decided to go home. Here's another one. If Joe comes to my house, I will greet him warmly. Same thing. Subject right here is I, and then will greet is the verb. So here's your complete simple sentence, and here's a subordinating one that uses the subordinating word if. If Joe comes to my house. So whenever you start a phrase with if or because or any of these words, before or since or unless, you're in the complex sentence structure. So you want to make sure you finish the idea. So this is actually really tricky. When you start a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, you have to know that you're in a complex sentence and that you're going to finish it later. Some are kind of more intuitive, like if. Most people sort of feel if I start a sentence with if, I'm going to have a then. If Joe comes to my house, then I will greet him. Some of the others are a little bit trickier, like before, before Joe comes to my house, he will need to go to the grocery store or something like that. You might not sort of recognize that as a subordinating phrase, but it is. But let's take a look at some of the inverse examples. So these are ones where you start a sentence with a subordinating phrase and end with a complete thought. Here's the reverse. I will park the car before I get out. Subject of the sentence, I, verb, will park the car before I get out. So this would be a complete thought, I get out, but since we use the subordinating word before, it turns it into a subordinate phrase. So I'll park the car before I get out. One thing to notice about this is that there's no comma in this sentence, but there is a comma in this sentence. So the rule is, if you start a sentence with a subordinating phrase, you have a comma at the end of the subordinating phrase, and then you have your complete idea. If you start a complex sentence with a complete idea, and then end with a subordinating phrase, no comma. Right? This rule can be really helpful with since or because. A lot of times when people put because in the middle of a sentence, they tend to put a comma before the because. It makes sense that Roger likes baseball, comma, since he's a big sports fan. But you wouldn't actually put this comma here, because this is just, because this right here is the subordinating phrase. Since he's a big sports fan, it makes sense that Roger likes baseball since he is a big sports fan. Or we could replace this with because. It makes sense that Roger likes baseball because he is a big sports fan, and we wouldn't put a comma before the because. So again, here, subject, it, verb, makes sense that Roger likes baseball. Subordinating word, since he's a big sports fan. He is a big sports fan would be a complete idea, but since we have the subordinating word since, it turns it into a subordinate idea. So that's the idea of the complex sentence. Oh, briefly, one other thing. A lot of times complex sentences are reversible, right? So we could choose to flip the sentence in most cases. I decided to go home because I was very tired, right? I will greet him warmly if Joe comes to my house. Before I get out, I will park the car. Since he's a big sports fan, it makes sense that Roger likes baseball. This last one sounds a little bit clunky, but typically you can sort of flip those back and forth. So that's really cool. If you know that rule about complex sentences and how the subordinate phrases work, you have a lot of control about how you can enter and begin sentences, and how you can connect sentences too. So there's the complex. Now let's take a look at the most complex of all, the compound complex sentence. The longest and most complicated sentence, the compound complex, as the name implies, includes two simple sentences connected with a semicolon. So it includes two simple sentences connected with a semicolon or a comma and a conjunction plus a subordinate phrase. Now we're getting into sort of crazy territory. This one's not actually used all that much, but I am going to show you a couple of examples. It gives you some leeway because this is, you can jam the most into a sentence when you use this type of sentence. This sentence right here, notice how it's very, very long. It's actually a simple sentence though. It's not a compound complex sentence. The longest and most complicated sentence, the compound complex, this is actually the subject, as the name implies, includes two simple sentences connected with a comma and a conjunction. So here's our verb. So this particular sentence here is a simple sentence. Even though it's very long, it only has one subject and one verb. But that's a little bit beside the point. Let's get to the compound complex sentence and see subject plus a verb, and then you need a comma and a conjunction or a semicolon, and then a subject and a verb, and a subordinate phrase. And they can kind of go in any order you choose. Let's take a look at some pretty simple ones. I went to the store, but Margaret stayed home since she was feeling ill. This one follows the exact structure I sort of laid out right here. Here's the subject, I went to the store, but Margaret stayed home since she was feeling ill, and here's her subordinate phrase. So that's a pretty good example there. Let's take a look at one more. It starts with the subordinate phrase. Because I can always identify my subjects and verbs, that's the subordinate phrase, since it has the word because. And here's the rest of the complex sentence. I can control a longer sentence like the compound complex sentence. Here's the semicolon, moving into my last complete idea. That gives me a lot of variety. So there's a nice sentence right there, and it makes a lot of sense too. Because I can identify my subjects and verbs, I can control a longer sentence like a compound sentence, compound complex sentence, I forgot to put complex in there, that gives me lots of variety. So there's a good example of the types. So there are the 4 types. Okay, so let's wrap it up. Knowing where your subjects and verbs are is imperative at all points in time in any sentence you write. And that allows you to utilize the 4 major sentence types: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. It also keeps you from committing major sentence errors. So if you can remember these simple rules of sentences, you can be your own grammar police to serve and correct. Thanks for watching. Bye.